If you picked up a box of cereal, a bag of bread, or a bottle of sports drink in the United States today, and then walked into a grocery store in the UK, France, or Germany with that same product, there's a real chance it wouldn't be allowed on the shelf. Not because of trade rules, because of what's inside it. There are ingredients currently sitting in American food that have been partially or fully restricted across the European Union. Not fringe chemicals, not obscure additives, things in products you probably bought this week. And the question worth asking isn't just, is this dangerous? It's a bigger one. Why do two developed, scientifically advanced parts of the world look at the same ingredient and come to completely opposite conclusions about whether it belongs in human food? To understand why this happens, you need to know one thing about how the US and Europe regulate food differently. Because it comes down to a single philosophical difference that shapes everything. In the European Union, the guiding principle is called the precautionary principle. Simplified, if there's credible evidence that something might cause harm, you restrict it until it's proven safe. The burden of proof sits with the manufacturer. You don't get the benefit of the doubt. In the United States, the system works almost in reverse. The FDA operates largely on what's called GRAS, generally recognized as safe. If an ingredient has been in use for a long time, or if the company introducing it determines it to be safe based on available evidence, it can stay in the food supply unless the FDA takes specific action to remove it. The burden of proof in many cases sits with the regulator, not the manufacturer. And the FDA, chronically underfunded and understaffed, often simply doesn't get there. That gap between "we haven't proven it's dangerous" and "we haven't proven it's safe" is where a handful of ingredients have been living for decades, used in millions of products, consumed by hundreds of millions of people, while other countries decided the risk wasn't worth it. And this isn't a fringe concern raised by people who distrust science. The Environmental Working Group has documented over 1,000 chemicals allowed in U.S. food that have never been formally reviewed by the FDA for safety. A study published in JAMA Internal Medicine found that the GRAS system contains fundamental conflicts of interest, with manufacturers routinely self-certifying the safety of their own additives without independent review. The researchers concluded the system was, in their words, broken. Let's get specific, because this is where it stops being abstract. The first one is potassium bromate. It's a flour additive used in commercial baking: bread, rolls, pizza dough, pastry. It makes dough stronger, helps it rise higher, gives the final product that appealing, uniform texture. It's been in American baked goods since the 1920s, and it's been banned in the EU, UK, Canada, China, and Brazil for decades. The reason? The International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is part of the World Health Organization, classifies potassium bromate as a possible human carcinogen. Animal studies have consistently shown it causes tumors in the kidney, thyroid, and other tissues. The FDA has known about these concerns since at least the 1990s and has repeatedly encouraged bakers to voluntarily stop using it. Not required, encouraged. It's still in use today. If you buy bread at a commercial bakery or order from a fast food chain, there's a reasonable chance it's in your food right now. The second ingredient is azodicarbonamide. And if that name doesn't ring a bell, you might know it by what it got called a few years ago, the yoga mat chemical, because it's the same compound used to make foamed plastics, including yoga mats and shoe soles. It's used in bread and baked goods as a dough conditioner. It improves elasticity, cuts processing time, makes industrial baking more efficient. Banned in the EU and Australia. When it's used in food and exposed to heat, it breaks down into semicarbazide and urethane, both of which have raised serious flags in safety research. The WHO reviewed it and noted the breakdown compounds as a concern. The EU concluded the risk wasn't acceptable. The US kept it on the GRAS list. Subway famously removed it from their bread in 2014 after a public campaign, but that's one chain. It's still widespread in commercial bread products across the country. Now, I want to be precise here, because I don't want this to land as, "these ingredients will definitely give you cancer." That's not what the science says. What it says is that the evidence raised enough concern in other regulatory bodies to restrict or ban these compounds, and that the US system, by design, hasn't applied the same standard. The harm isn't always acute. It's not like eating one sandwich and feeling sick. It's cumulative. It's low level. It's the kind of thing that's very hard to trace back to a specific source, which is partly why it persists. The third is brominated vegetable oil, BVO, used for years in citrus-flavored sports drinks and sodas to keep the artificial flavoring from separating and floating to the top. Banned in the EU and Japan, and notably, the FDA actually proposed revoking its GRAS status in 2022, citing animal studies showing the bromine accumulates in body tissue over time and affects the thyroid. Several major beverage companies have already removed it from their formulas, but it's still present in some regional and store brand drinks that haven't made the switch. 3 ingredients, all with documented safety concerns serious enough that other developed nations remove them from their food supply. All still technically legal here. So the obvious question is, if other countries have banned these, why hasn't the US? The answer has less to do with science than most people assume. The food industry in the United States spends hundreds of millions of dollars annually on lobbying. The relationship between the FDA and the companies it regulates is, to put it diplomatically, complicated. Under the GRAS system, a company can introduce a new food additive, commission its own safety review, determine it's safe, and begin using it in products, all without ever formally notifying the FDA. That's not a conspiracy theory, that's how the system is legally structured. The Government Accountability Office raised concerns about exactly this in a report going back to 2010, noting that the FDA had no systematic way of even knowing what substances were being self-certified as safe. And the FDA does act, eventually. VIVO took roughly 70 years from initial safety concerns being raised to the agency formally moving to revoke its approval. 70 years. That's not a regulatory system proactively protecting public health. That's a system that responds when the pressure gets high enough. I hear this constantly. There's a tendency to think, well, if it were really dangerous, they'd have pulled it. Someone would have caught it. The system would have worked. And I understand that instinct. We want to believe the institutions designed to protect us are actually doing that. But the history of food regulation in this country doesn't really support that level of trust. Trans fats were in the American food supply for decades, while the evidence against them mounted. Red dye number 3 was flagged as a potential carcinogen by the FDA itself in 1990, and it took until 2024 for it to be formally banned. 34 years. Meanwhile, it was in your maraschino cherries, your canned fruit, your kids' medications. And this is what worries me, not the individual ingredients in isolation. It's the cumulative picture. The average American is exposed to hundreds of food additives across a given week. Most have never been independently studied in combination with each other. The research that does exist tends to look at single compounds in isolation. But that's not how people eat. You're consuming dozens daily over a lifetime. And the long-term interactive effects of that are essentially unknown. A study published in Nature Food analyzed over 12,000 food additives permitted in the U.S. food supply and found that fewer than 7% had enough toxicological data to even properly evaluate their safety. Fewer than 7%. The rest were operating on historical use, industry assurances, or simply the absence of evidence of harm, which, as we established at the start, is not the same thing as evidence of safety. So let's make this practical, because the point of understanding all of this isn't to make you afraid of food, it's to make you a more informed buyer. And the good news is that navigating this is simpler than it sounds. The first move is learning to read ingredient labels. Not nutrition labels, ingredient labels. They're different. The nutrition label tells you calories, fat, sodium. The ingredient label tells you what's actually in the product. And that's where these additives show up. Potassium bromate will be listed as potassium bromate. Azodicarbonamide is usually spelled out in full. BVO appears as brominated vegetable oil. They're not hidden in code, they're just in small print that most people skip. The second move is understanding that the store brand and the name brand are often not the same formula. Major manufacturers have quietly reformulated many products for their European markets while keeping the original formula for the US market. Same brand. Different ingredient list depending on which country you buy it in. That's not speculation. It's been documented across multiple product categories, from breakfast cereals to soft drinks to snack foods. which means the reformulated version exists. The manufacturer knows how to make the product without the additive. They just haven't been required to do it here. The third move, and this one matters more than any specific ingredient, is shifting the overall balance of what you eat toward foods that don't have ingredient lists at all. Vegetables, fruit, meat, fish, eggs, legumes, whole grains. Not because processed food is always dangerous, but because the more your diet is built around whole foods, the less exposure you have to this entire category of concern. You're not eliminating risk, you're reducing the surface area. Now, and I want to be clear about this, I'm not saying never eat bread or never drink a sports drink. That's not a realistic or useful message. What I am saying is that knowing what's in your food and making deliberate choices about it is different from assuming the label is protecting you. It often isn't. The label tells you what's in the product. It doesn't tell you whether that thing belongs in your body. Think about where we started. 2 developed countries, same ingredient, completely opposite decisions about whether it's acceptable. One system asks manufacturers to prove safety before approval. The other asks regulators to prove harm before removal. You're living inside the second system, and the practical response to that isn't panic, it's paying attention. Read the label, know the names, and trust your food supply a little less blindly than most people do. That's enough to make a real difference.